Time to get extreme! Get your Dunkaroos and your Squeeze-Its! We're taking another trip back to the 90s!
Coming to paperback and e-readers, ISIS Legacy. The sorority secrets of the goddess next door are revealed in this all-new ISIS series adventure. Pre-order your copy of ISIS Legacy on Amazon.com today. In a previous video, I talked about the Extreme era of Marvel Comics that took place from 1994 to 1996. Now, this Extreme era of Marvel Comics is as equally reviled as the what they call all-new, all-different era of Marvel Comics that started in 2016 that some comics readers call SJW Marvel. Now, the Extreme era of Marvel Comics was a reaction from Marvel editorial to the popularity of Image Comics at the time. Now, back in the 1990s, Image Comics was selling like gangbusters and having blockbuster sales on titles like Spawn, Wildcats, and Youngblood. And your Marvel, which was feeling the impact from losing three of its most popular talents, Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane, sought to overcompensate by creating an extreme version of many of their Marvel characters in the hopes of trying to get some sales. Now, this was what Marvel did to react to the Image changing the entire marketplace. However, DC applied a completely different approach to comics than Marvel. And because DC applied a completely different approach than Marvel, many of these 1990s versions of DC characters are often seen in a positive light, and many people see the 1990s era of DC as practically a new golden age for the DC brand. Now, DC Comics wasn't too eager to go out here and get extreme because they had already made radical changes to the DC universe back in 1986 with the Crisis of Infinite Earths. Now, the Crisis of Infinite Earths was supposed to try to make the DC universe more accessible to readers, and one of the things that your DC Comics wanted to do with the Crisis of Infinite Earths was introduce a concept of legacy heroes. Now, legacy heroes is something that comes from DC's Earth 2 with characters like Helena Wayne's Huntress, who was a part of the old DC universe, but DC Comics wanted to carry that over, and they started rebuilding their concept of legacy heroes with Wally West. Now, Wally West was the Kid Flash from pre-Crisis DC, but when Barry Allen died in the Crisis of Infinite Earths, Wally West took up his uncle's mantle and took over the role of being DC Universe's Flash. Now, this whole concept of legacy heroes was one that was seen as an extremely positive thing to come out of the DC Universe, and many comic fans really liked the whole idea of Wally taking on the mantle of the Flash, and the Flash went on to become one of DC's most popular books. Now, as DC was moving from the 80s to the 90s, they decided to further build on Wally West's and the whole concept of legacy heroes. Now, they introduced a new version of Robin to replace the less than popular version of Robin, Jason Todd, but who was killed after a phone poll. And they went out here again looking to build on the legacy of the Robin mantle with the storyline A Lonely Place of Dying. And with the storyline A Lonely Place of Dying, they decided to bring in a new Robin in a more organic fashion, and this organic fashion was with him being accepted by the previous Robin, Dick Grayson, and then being trained by supporting characters in the Batman universe like Lady Shiva. Now, this whole reintroduction of the Robin character with Tim Drake also went over very well due to the whole concept of bringing the character in as a legacy character, and then bringing them in an organic fashion. Now, this whole pattern of bringing in new characters was something that carried over into the 90s, and in the 90s, DC Comics then decided to bring in more legacy characters with classic storylines like Batman's Sword of Azrael, which led into Nightfall, which led to the fall of Bruce Wayne as Batman when he took on Bane, and then brought in John Paul Valley as Batman. Now, the John Paul Valley Batman was something that was meant to copy the Captain America No More the Captain storyline, where your Steve Rogers gave up the mantle of Captain America, and then John Walker took over the mantle. And it was meant to get people to understand why Batman was important and why his approaches to crime fighting were important. However, the Azrael character did get over very well, and even some people still like the Azrael version of Batman. Now, along with Nightfall, we also had the death of Superman, and the death of Superman, and in its aftermath, introduced 4 very popular characters: the Steel, the Cyborg Superman, Superboy, and the Eradicator. Now, out of the 4, 2 of those characters went over to become very popular heroes in the 90s. Your Steel and your Superboy went on to become fan favorites. And that, again, all showed the whole concept of legacy and family doing very well for DC, introducing brand new characters by attaching them to previously popular characters and then getting them over with new readers. Now, the legacy concept continued on with your Green Lantern, which was suffering at the time due to an extremely horrible Gerard Jones run, and your DC Comics deciding, while they were just going out here rebuilding many of their characters under the whole legacy concept, decided to make your Hal Jordan Parallax. Now, this decision to heel turn Hal Jordan was controversial, but it was something that had to be done after the horrifically bad Gerard Jones run, which practically damaged the character extensively because it did not fit in an organic fashion. Now, your Hal Jordan was turned heel after the destruction of Coast City, which came out of the reign of the Superman storyline and the return of Superman storyline, and this led to the introduction of a new Green Lantern, Kyle Rayner. Now, the Kyle Rayner character had a completely different look with his crab mask and gauntlets, which were very controversial at the time, but went on to become iconic over the last 20 to 25 years. Now, the Kyle Rayner character brought back the Green Lantern franchise and enabled it to remain a very popular brand, and he basically saved the entire Green Lantern brand. Now, in addition to your Kyle Rayner, we got your Aquaman got a refresh where he was given a more of a harder edge in addition to a hook hand, and this was also a very popular redesign that readers really enjoyed. Now, there were other characters who got revamped, but this was right after Zero Hour. Now, in Zero Hour, which was a fine-tuning of the Crisis of Infinite Earths, we saw the DC Universe reshape once again, but out of that whole reshaping, we did get some fresh new characters like Jack Knight's Starman, which went on to become another very popular character in the 90s. Now, DC Comics did do some really extreme things during the mid-90s, like Superman Red and Superman Blue, and Extreme Justice. And your Superman Red and Superman Blue, yes, it was controversial, but it didn't really do that much damage to the brand of Superman, and it did lead to more readers picking up the book. Now, your Extreme Justice, which came out of the whole Giffen DeMatteis era of Justice League, it was one of those things that failed, and there were a lot of extreme concepts out of DC Comics that failed, like Guy Gardner Warrior, and many other failed concepts that were at DC. But DC, overall, for the 90s, was extremely positive. I mean, some of the redesigns people really loved, like Jim Balent's Catwoman, and people still enjoy Peter David's Supergirl. So there are a lot of good characters that came out of DC's 90s era, and many people have fond memories of a lot of really great DC comics out of the 90s. Now, the 90s era at DC, it was one of the most creative eras, and one of the things that I think led to DC having such great success was that they invested in so much top talent as related to writing. Now, when you look at DC Comics and the writers that they hired, it's some of the most talented people in comics. I mean, they had Mark Waid on The Flash, they had Ron Mars on Green Lantern, they had Doug Mahnke on Batman, they had Roger Stern on Superman, they had your Chuck Dixon on a dozen titles like Robin, Nightwing, Birds of Prey. I mean, I think he did Green Arrow as well. But DC Comics, they just had a really solid group of creative teams, and they also had Peter David on Aquaman and Supergirl. So DC Comics was their whole creative teams were rock solid, and they didn't really focus too much on artists at the time. They usually focused on writers, and their focus on writers was the whole thing that led to DC having such great success as related to revamping their characters and making them fresh for a new generation of readers. Now, there were, again, some duds out there, like your Guy Gardner Warrior and books like Teen Titans, but I would say that the revamp of Teen Titans, it was a lot better than many people say that it was. It was your Dan Jurgens did a really great job of trying to stay true to the Titans and their mission, and he did a great job of trying to bridge the gaps of the 60s era Titans, the 80s era Titans, and trying to introduce new characters. Unfortunately, the book never really got its momentum, but the whole thing was DC did take good risks, and they really put together some really solid stories in their books. So a lot of people, when they think of DC, again, they think of it very fondly in the 90s, and they think of it fondly because DC's editorial was on point. And because DC's editorial was on point, they made sure that the best writers were working on their characters and keeping them consistent with the brand. And that was one of the things that made DC a very memorable experience for readers in the 90s that Marvel wasn't. DC's editorial managed to stay consistent. Yes, they did change a lot of characters' looks visually, but the whole thing was the characters themselves stayed true to who they were, and because they stayed true to who they were, readers still stayed with those books all the way through the 90s and into the early 2000s until your Dan Didio came on and became the new editor-in-chief at DC Comics. When Dan Didio came along, that's when the DC brand fell apart, but the DC brand in the 90s really grew, and we saw many characters go on to become icons, and we saw lots of new franchises start, like Steel, Superboy, Nightwing, got Tim Drake's Robin, Impulse. I mean, the list goes on, and there were many small independent characters that still have small followings, like the Heckler and many other characters. While their books were not very successful, they still were seen in a positive light. So DC Comics was seen very differently in the 90s, and I can tell you from buying many of those comics, they were all top quality, and you never got disappointed when you picked up a DC comic. Even though the characters had changed visually, you still got the same level of quality. And DC did very well during the extreme 90s, and they even managed to revive their Justice League brand with the new JLA book by Grant Morrison, again showing us that their focus on writers over artists, this was one of the best things that they did as related to editorial, because so many great classic stories came out of DC that people, again, remember that era fondly. Now, DC not only did very well as related to its superhero comics, it also expanded into other areas of comic storytelling with the Vertigo brand. Now, the Vertigo brand gave us John Constantine, and it also gave us a whole lot of other great concepts, and it took risks creatively with storytelling. So that's another era of DC Comics that people remember fondly, because DC was not only killing it as related to superheroes, but they were also killing it as related to exploring all sorts of different concepts in the comics genre. So when people think about DC Comics, they think of a success as related to remaining consistent and building on the legacy of existing heroes, and then bringing us a new generation of heroes. And that's one of the things I liked about DC in the 90s, was they took the Crisis of Infinite Earths, created the concept of legacy heroes, and then went out here and built new brands with these legacy heroes, while keeping their existing iconic characters like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman out there. They managed to go out here and make new characters household names, and they even managed to revive one of the oldest brands, the Justice Society of America, with the new JSA comic, further building on the concept of legacy heroes. And that concept of legacy heroes was one of the things that made DC one of the most popular brands of comics in the 90s, and one of the most beloved eras of DC Comics. And one of the things that I find to be interesting is nobody in the toy industry never wants to really merchandise the 90s outside of the whole Total Justice line, but the 90s era of DC Comics is a gold mine. And if anybody like Mattel, who had DC license at the time, were to go out here and merchandise to those 90s comics fans, they would have found themselves making a lot of money. Unfortunately, they didn't do that with the DC Universe Classics line, and your Todd McFarlane right now isn't seeing the gold mine that was there with 90s DC. 90s DC is a beloved era, and it's like a second golden age for many comic fans, and the 90s era of DC is a complete contrast to the extreme era of Marvel, because when your DC expressed extreme discipline, they went out here and revamped many of their characters, and they turned many of their characters into fan favorites for the next generation of comic fans. And when I look at the whole business model of 90s DC, it is an example of what a company can do to make their characters fresh for a new generation of readers, and make their characters relatable for a new generation of readers, and an example of how to bring characters forward and in a positive way, and a great example of how to go out here and present your characters in a way that keeps them competitive while not going out to the radical extremes of image. Your DC Comics optically were, in the 90s, some of the best comics to ever come out of that era. Now, if you want to see me make more videos about comics like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to pick up some of my action-packed African-American fantasy fiction on the SJS Direct imprint, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and the books of the Spinsterella trilogy, you can find all those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them on Smashwords, the iBook Store, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, ISIS, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. The goddess next door takes on the threat of a deadly digital diva driven to destroy the world in this action-packed, all-new ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess, featuring a bonus pin-up and the other 2 books in the Cyber Goddess saga at online bookstores everywhere today.